Hello. How's it going, Kirk? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Hey, I can hear you too. Trying out a new loading screen. So anyway, hi, welcome back to TypeScript Tuesdays, our weekly, sort of mostly weekly stream where we talk about TypeScript and everything around that. I lost my notes, and so I don't have them. But anyway, TypeScript Tuesdays is hosted by Virtual Coffee. Virtual Coffee's mission, let's see if I can do this off the top of my head, is to be a welcoming community. Nope, I can't do it. I bet I have it somewhere. Let's see. Anyway, Virtual Coffee is dope, and we're awesome. You can follow us, virtualcoffee.io. Check us out. Follow us on Twitter, virtualcoffee.io. I will do the intro as an outro later. But anyway, thank you everybody for coming along. And with me today is my buddy and newly Canadian friend, Kirk. Kirk, how's it going?
I don't know if I'm allowed to say that I'm Canadian, but I do live in the tundra now. Today is -31, so just here.
Nice. Well, wait, what is -31 in American? Like, that's Celsius, right?
Yes, although at that point it's not that much different.
Oh yeah, you're right. That's pretty cold.
Yes,
Got a lot of snow.
yesterday we get to go out, and I'm like, we gotta like get the snow off the car, and then I forgot my gloves, so I just got the brusher thing, and I'm just going at it. And about like 5 minutes in, I'm like, oh, this was a mistake, and
Yeah.
my hands burned for 30 minutes afterwards. Even while I was back inside, they were just like, oh, this is a problem. So don't be
A
like me,
little,
folks. Wear your
little bit
gloves.
of frostbite action. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
nothing wakes you up quite like the fear of losing digits.
lukewarm water can help if you're inside already. Don't do that if you're outside. It'll make it worse. But if
Oh,
you're trying to warm up your hands or your feet, don't do hot water because you won't be able to tell if it's too hot. But anyway, that's a little Eagle Scout trick for you.
nice.
Yeah.
No more TypeScript. We only do survival tips now. This is a survival stream. You're Les Stroud, and I don't want to be Bear Grylls.
I'm here for it, except Bear Grylls, who is a phony, and I don't like him at all. So we got to find somebody different.
Sorry.
Uh, you know, I mean, he's got a cool name, but that's really all he's got going for him. I saw a, I don't know, whatever. You can just like search for videos of Bear Grylls phony and find some funny things. There's a really good one where he's like working himself up really, really hard to like jump across a ravine, like a little ravine, and like he's like measuring it and trying, like thinking really hard and like sweating it out. And then some guys went and found that exact spot and then just panned the camera over to the left, and the ravine just like went to a point and ended. And then they kept panning over, and then there's a parking lot right there. So
I mean, okay, I don't want to be a Bear Grylls apologist. I will just say he himself, like off his show, he's like the youngest Scoutmaster General, and he was like, I think he was like the youngest person to climb Mount Everest or whatever. did that. He can survive. Just
Hmm.
everything on
Hmm.
the show is
Yep.
mainly manufactured for entertainment.
Yeah, sure. Sure can. Uh, yeah. Anyway, so yeah, today I thought we'd do something just a little bit different. Instead of looking at some code or some specific things about TypeScript, I got into a debate with somebody that I've worked with for a long time, know and I've known for a long time, and he he's been developing for about as long as I have, at least, if not a little longer. So 15, 20 years, something like that, and uh, is mostly a Ruby developer, but has written plenty and plenty of JavaScript and knows JavaScript pretty well, and was not interested in TypeScript at all. And and I was this was last over the last couple of days, and I've been kind of recovering from being sick and stuff like that. So I didn't super have the energy to really debate it, or like try to change his mind at all. I just sort of acknowledged his feelings and moved on. But I thought that maybe we could try to, we could try to find some like some headlines or some specific arguments for or against, or maybe I can come up with some against, and then we can figure out why, things like that. Kirk,
Hey, yeah, well,
does that sound cool?
it sounds cool and it also sounds very relevant. Um, Maybe not started in the same way, but I've definitely had similar conversations with people where they're like, "Hey, what are you working on?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm doing some TypeScript stuff." I'm like, "I don't like TypeScript." I'm like, "Well, I don't know where this conversation goes." So,
Yeah, I mean, and to be fair and clear, like this is pretty much how I felt maybe a year ago or something like that. I was like, I don't need this. I've been doing JavaScript for so many years. Like, why do I need this other thing?
mhm.
And I've been doing TypeScript for less than a year, and I like it a lot, and I've come to like rely on it. But s- it's still new enough for me that I have trouble, you know, like explaining why, right? I mean, there's like some surface level stuff where like you're like, oh, it helps you find errors or whatever. Um, but uh, that's not really good enough, and
No,
not really good enough to change anybody's mind. And yeah, so I guess let me ask you this, Kirk. Like on the first, like we this doesn't have to be a full answer, but like, what are the headlines for you? Like, if somebody says why use TypeScript, if somebody asks you why use TypeScript over JavaScript at a party or something, right? Like like not as a like book report or like a professor asking you or something like that, right? But like, what's your elevator pitch? Top headlines: TypeScript over JavaScript.
wow. Okay, TypeScript over JavaScript. Uh, I think I don't know. I feel like the big one has got to be uh, surfacing errors. And immediately as I say that, I sort of like know the pushback on that, where people are like, oh, but I still find errors with TypeScript. Like, yeah, but it's like a when you find errors thing. It's like TypeScript helps you identify potential errors or bugs before you run the code. And to me, that's the biggest advantage of like statically typed or like compiled languages over dynamic languages when the errors like occur. Um, Again, like I don't know if you're supposed to be doing the devil's advocate because as I say this, I immediately know again like there's another like
I
counter here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you want to format. I had this idea earlier today, so I didn't really, get into the format. I'd be happy to play devil's advocate because that's one of my like favorite things to do.
Joys.
Yeah, it is. It really is. But at the same time, like if you are, you know, this happened to me too when I'm trying to explain it. I start coming up with counter arguments for the things that I'm
Right.
explaining, and I get caught up in my own head. And so I thought
So
maybe we could work through it together. But
yeah,
um,
no. So I'll say like so I'll leave it at this like so. Step one, I say services errors. They say get errors anyway. I'm like, but you get them like at compile time, not runtime. And then there's a weird middle ground, right? Because you could just say, well, just if you're working in VS Code, you can just turn on TypeScript as a linter, right? Which would do pretty much the same thing, um, and solve that problem. So now there's this statement of like, so why even go like full TypeScript? So it's like there's like TypeScript over raw unchecked JS, sure. But then there's like, why going full .ts files over just JS files with TypeScript linting, right? And then I feel like the compiler time error thing is that's not enough. Then you actually do have to talk about like making your own types and type driven development.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's actually interesting. I mean, the like linting, just turning on the linter, but not having it be TypeScript. That I think the honestly his argument and that the one argument that I had in my head before about this errors stuff is like I'm already doing some type checking. It's just like in JavaScript, like as an experienced developer, right? This is
Mm-hmm.
like learning JavaScript, to a certain level. So this is like different than beginners, right? So like if you're talking about somebody who writes JavaScript for like at an experience level, right?
Yeah.
Um, to do things like sometimes to do things like okay, check to see that a property exists in an object before trying to access it. If it's possible to have that property, like you know what I mean. Whereas you might not have to do that in TypeScript technically if you are telling it like if you're using the types like a typed language, then you can say, okay, this thing is well, I don't know. I'm getting all mixed up now. But like the there's a lot of the like safety stuff that you can just do in JavaScript if you are careful enough without the types, right? I don't think everything you can.
Yes.
But it's like you start getting into so if you have like a union of object types, TypeScript will make you do those checks, right? Make you do the type narrowing or whatever. And lots of time, and that's just writing JavaScript. You're like, okay, if this thing is, if it has a whatever, an hours parameter, then it's a time object. And if it has a week parameter, then it's a data, whatever. That's not a good example, but you know what I mean? The TypeScript forces you to do it, which is good, right? But the, like his basically argument in that sense was like, well, just learn the language, like learn JavaScript, you know? So this is my first typed, like strongly typed language since uh college, which was a long time ago too. Um, and so those like sets of arguments, like I don't have a good sense of those in my head, Um, but yeah, that's definitely one part of the puzzle. Is like is trying to come up with like argument like maybe examples or arguments where TypeScript is going to save you where you couldn't do it in JavaScript, right? And those examples for me are hard to come by. I haven't done a lot of googling, but I don't know. Can you think of anything that you've done recently or anything we've done here where it's like, okay, this would be way harder to do and maybe not natural at all to do in JavaScript, but the TypeScript, makes it straightforward. Um,
Honestly, I don't know. It's if we're using we can't do in JS, I feel like that's almost well the whole point is that like TypeScript goes away, right? So like in terms of like the mechanics of what you're doing, everything you do in TypeScript is possible in JS because it all becomes JS anyways.
right.
Um, it's so to me like the difference is not like what you can do with TypeScript, it's like what you can't do in TypeScript. Like TypeScript allows you to say what things can't be in a way that like JS does not like allow at all. Like JS has like no capacity to do. So to me, like that's what TypeScript works. Like it's the constraints that make it super powerful, and it can like say like, oh, this has to be like this shape or this style, or like based on this thing, this has to be this thing in a way that like the architecture of doing that in JavaScript is so laborious or complex or involved that you would just never do it in the first place, right? So, and this kind of gets back to what's the advantage of writing TS over JS? the code I write when I'm writing TypeScript is of a slightly different style and flavor than what I would write if I was writing raw JS, because it's just the things I'm allowed to say can and cannot happen. Like force the shape into like this. It's just different. Um, and like we've been doing just like this, like now we've been doing this like advent of code stuff, and I know like you've been using TypeScript, and some other people have been using JavaScript, and I don't even know if it's noticeable for you there, but even there, um, I've noticed type versus untyped languages, the type of things that I'm saying and the way I'm thinking about like how the data is going, it's just different. Um, TypeScript lets me say things like, oh, this string has to be these four things, but even like, oh, because this is these four things, this has to be something else, or like, oh, this can only be these two strings in this group of four other things. Again, can you do that in JS? Absolutely, but like the way of doing that is very weird. And I'm thinking of a language like Python. We don't tend to use classes too much in JS. In Python, there's like classes and there's like meta classes, and a lot of what you would just do with the TypeScript type system, you can do in Python. And the answer is to like do wonky class logic and like inherited members and abstract classes and all these like really fancy structures. Whereas in TypeScript, I can just say, hey, this thing is this string or that record. And then it's like, cool, I'll make sure that works for you. You know? Um, so yeah, that to me is the big delimiter. Like the capacity to say like what things are and aren't. With JS, you've got 7 types, right? It's just like number, string, object, array, symbol, like a couple other things. And like that's it. Everything's really just
Right.
those things. They only like warn you, or you can only really check like type of will only work with pretty much those four things. Whereas TypeScript lets you check anything. So I don't know. That to
Yeah.
me is like very relevant and important and powerful. And once you start thinking about that more, you start to see people change. Like they go from just like, these are all strings to thinking like, is this a string? Like, is this a number? Is it something else? Like, what is it really? And that feels good, I guess.
It feels good. Yeah. I like it. Yeah. I mean, I agree with all that, and it's, I don't know. I was having a hard time, argue. I was having a hard time with this. But like, I like all that stuff. I like what you said there, and I like how that kind of shakes out. Another argument that was showing up against it is it's just like the general idea of, oh, this thing is compiling to JavaScript, and so it's sort of like adding complexity to a system, right? And it's adding. Um, I mean, I guess it has like he's really struggling with that fact, right? Like like we're writing a thing that's going to run in browsers or whatever, or running in a node environment that ultimately is JavaScript. The package we're publishing is going to be JavaScript, not TypeScript, right? It'll have a type definition if we do TypeScript, but like it'll, the code that's pulled in is JavaScript, and so why abstract it away? And I guess that's kind of what we're talking about here. But that was another argument that he had, and I I don't know. I was like, I kind of I wonder if that argument resonates with anybody, or if that's something you think about when you're adding when you're like talking about tools or deciding on tools to use, um, or not.
Not, I don't know. To me, I would say like not necessarily. Um, the very immediate, maybe like blase response to that, which is probably not valid. It's just like you can make that argument for anything, right? It's like what's stopping you from saying like, well, why write JavaScript? Like the browser's just going to turn that into like C++ anyway, because like that's the actual thing the browsers are written in, And it's like, oh, why write C++? Like it's, I don't know, like the idea of like don't write a thing because it's like going to be transformed into something else. All of programming is writing anything that gets transformed into something else. Like we're always like working on new, you know, um, DSLs, right? The new domain specific language that becomes something else. And whether you use something or not, it's just like, does this DSL help me do the thing that I'm trying to do? Does it feel expressive? Do I feel like I'm empowered to make the solutions I want using this thing? You know, that was like, well, why use a React framework when it's just going to become like raw.js? So like that. And I obviously I get what he's saying, but just the mechanics of that response are a little hazy. To be more specific, I think like maybe the proper way of saying that is like, why use a programming language, like a generic style programming language, to write code that is going to become like essentially the same code and is slightly different? Because like TypeScript is syntactically right, and it's like it's not that big of a transform. It's JS plus stuff. So the art is like, why use this thing? It's just like it's really just this thing plus some stuff. You could just write the thing. Um, and then I do think it comes back to like all the things we have. Like TypeScript does everything that JavaScript does, but there are some things that TypeScript can do that JavaScript can never and will never do. You know, it's like, are those things important to you or not? If they are, then TypeScript seems great. If they're not, then I guess it doesn't matter. Like if TypeScript really has not offering you really any benefits, or you think those benefits come with like too many like problems, then yeah, you probably should just be using JS, right? And our argument is that the benefits of TypeScript outweigh the the disadvantages of TypeScript. So it's sort of like, now I'm thinking like, what are the disadvantages of TypeScript? But I would say like the fact that TypeScript becomes JavaScript is not a disadvantage of TypeScript. That's just what TypeScript is. I don't know. That's just how it works. You know, as a different but farther example, I got into front end development. Like writing Elm. Elm gets compiled to JavaScript. Doesn't mean Elm is bad, but Elm is so far removed from JS. It's like it's a whole different thing. There's F sharp to JavaScript. There's Python to JavaScript. There's Ruby to JavaScript. There's like all these things to JavaScript. Like they're not invalidated because like they become JavaScript. It's just like that's the interface. So now I'm trying to think like, or maybe I want to throw this to you. Like what you've been using it for a year. What do you think is like a downside of TypeScript, or something that's like caused you problems when using it that you wouldn't have with JavaScript?
Um, yeah, so I think, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I was going to ask you that question too, but I'll answer first. So downsides of JavaScript, and I agree. Like, I don't have a problem with the processing, things like that. And I think you mentioned this. If we are using React, we're already processing anyway, and it's not like we're never just writing JavaScript and then sending it off. It's always going through
Yeah.
Rollup or Webpack or whatever. Anyway, right? It would be kind of irresponsible to serve on just like JavaScript that you wrote to the world, right? Um, for a lot of reasons, and so I agree with you there. And like the abstract nature of it is like, I think you said that very well. And it's something I've thought about too. Yes, this is an abstraction. Like this is like on you're like a little bit removed from JavaScript, more than even you would be. But at the same time, like yeah, the browser is doing its own thing anyway. Like I don't know. So what are some downsides of TypeScript? I mean, so one downside, obviously, and this is kind of part of the problem, right? Is people who are people who know JavaScript well and don't know TypeScript at all. There's there's like a cost, of um, like there's a learning curve, right? There's like it looks unfamiliar. It looks like very strange. I had a hard time. I still kind of sometimes have a hard time reading TypeScript. Um,
Mm-hmm.
if my mind isn't in, like if it's not like the project that I'm on, if I'm just writing like or if I'm reading a complicated TypeScript file that somebody else wrote, uh, I still I still sometimes find it hard to read and hard to look at.
Yes.
And so that's sort of a downside, I mean, and there's like there's other things like that. And then you know another potential downside I could see is, so like we have these like strongly typed things, and we usually like I don't really think there's a point of using TypeScript without having it on strict mode, you know. But that like adds like a bunch of checking that is probably good, but maybe is not like for instance, we are working in Remix, right? And so it's like this, you know, a front end framework. Well, it's like a full stack framework, and one of the things it does is, and actually, now that I am about to say this, this isn't Remix specific at all, right? So if you have a form that is submitted through Node, right, and you get the form response or like the I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head. I think it is. Anyway, the way to get a value from a form input, right? So that somebody has like posted, it returns back like an input could be either a, a string or it can be a file object, right? Because if it's a file, if it's like type equals file, you know, there's a whole
Hmm.
bunch of stuff, right? But if I have like a name field, you know, I TypeScript is going to force me to make sure that that is a string and not a type file, right?
Yes.
And I suppose that's good. But like the only way that that's ever going to happen, maybe somebody is like trying to hack something, you know? And in that case, like if it throws some error, like I don't care. You know what I mean? Like the only way that that's going to ever happen that I'm going to get a not string from that thing is if there's some funny business going on. And like if the like two, you know, string that split or whatever, you know, like whatever string method I'm doing is,
Hmm.
you know, it ultimately throws an error that's uncaught. Like, you know, I don't know. So it's kind of a minor thing, you know, but it is, uh, it could be considered a downside, you know. Um,
Yeah. No.
and,
Totally.
you know, uh, and so I suppose there's that. And then there's just the general concept of like a thing that is not JavaScript that is made to compile to JavaScript, like it could go away sometime or stop being
Hmm.
maintained. Like it doesn't seem very likely, you know what I mean? But like it is possible, right? If Microsoft and like this is like comical now that Microsoft owns it because it's you know it seems so unlikely that you know to, to be almost impossible. But like if Microsoft decided to stop supporting it, uh, we'd have to migrate everything. You know what I mean? It would just be like this whole huge thing, and like people have run into that, and I'm sure you've run into that in smaller packages or other things, right? But if the whole code base is like you not getting new versions anymore, you know, like that could be a big problem. And I
Yes.
think like people are going through. So there's some people that are going through that with CoffeeScript right now, and CoffeeScript is still, I think, still supported and stuff, right? I just think it's become less. You know,
Yeah.
TypeScript has kind of taken it over, and so there are companies, projects, and companies that are struggling to migrate uh, to TypeScript, for instance. Um, and I think
It's
that's I don't know if that's a downside or just a risk or whatever. Like I guess it's a downside of like writing in something that's not JavaScript. Um,
yeah.
a potential downside is the potential risk. You know, if that makes sense. I don't know
Um,
if that makes sense or not, but
no, totally. It's and I think CoffeeScript's like a really good example, right, of this thing that in certain circles everyone's like, this is the only way we're going to be doing X, Y, and Z, and it just never like took off. And then you just have this stuff now where it's like, well, what do I do with this stuff? Or every time you choose something away from JS, like there's still so many more JS developers than there are TS developers or whatever other language you're using to compile to JS. It's like, well, this makes it harder to find people who are really good at this. And I think, yeah, the biggest thing, or for me, the biggest thing you mentioned is like the increased complexity, right? Like JS is a language, the language is a set of features. JS has a lot of features. The language has been around for 30 odd years. I think the language is as old as I am. Because I remember like Python was written in 91. I was born in 91. So I'm like, I'm as old as Python. JS is pretty much the same age. So it's already a 30-year language of stuff. And then it's like, hey, here's another thing on top of it. And TypeScript's promise is that it's like, it's just JS with a type layer. So it's all the complexity of JS plus all the complexity of a type system. And then you just have to figure that out, right? And yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe this is like the biggest argument against it, which is like, I already know JS. My options are write more of the thing I know, or now learn this new thing on top of the thing I know. You don't want to do that. And in that regard, I feel like TypeScript is almost, and I feel like we've both seen this, the resistance to TypeScript. If like the longer you've written JS, the more likely you are to resist TypeScript, right? Because it's like, well, why? Why now? You know? Um, Although my counter to that is sort of like, well, it's a bit, it's not exactly the same, but it's a bit like to me when ES5 and ES6 happened, right? They made very big changes to the existing language with some very like big paradigm shifts, right? It's like, hey, we're not doing vars anymore. Or like, hey, we now have this whole arrow function syntax. Like there's a lot of, and in a similar way, you'd be like, well, why should I use these new features? I just learned the old features, you know? So we have classes now. Like I already learned prototypes. Like, why should I learn classes now? But I feel like it kind of comes with the same benefits in the sense of like, this is less error prone. This sort of like streamlines a lot of things. So there's like more consistency. We fixed a couple problems. Like things are more efficient. Like you should probably use this new thing over the old thing. Um, you're like, yeah, why should I learn this new thing? CSS is another good example of like in this old established language that has recently had some like major changes and updates. And it's like, well, hey, do you learn the new stuff? Like, I already know the old stuff. I'm good at the old stuff. You want me to go back to being bad at something again? And that's
Totally.
painful,
Yeah.
right? It's like one thing to like dabble in like your home code with some like strange language. Another thing like, oh, I'm gonna make myself like not be good at work again. I don't like that feeling. I never want to feel like this. So I think there's a little bit of that, but definitely um, TypeScript's a big, it's a complexity jump. If you've never done a type language, it's a big complexity jump, and I do think there's something for, I don't know. There's no research on this. I'd be interested to see how difficult is it to learn types after you spend a ton of time with dynamic languages versus like just jumping into programming immediately of the types. My intuition is that it's not a difficulty difference. It's just, it's like the difference between like your pain threshold and your pain tolerance. You know, a lot of people think that people have like very different pain thresholds, but it's like, no, most people, the pain threshold is the same. Just some people are like more sensitive to that pain. And I feel like if you're just coming into programming and someone's like, here, these are types, you're like, okay, these are types. Sure. It's all new. But if you've been doing this for a while with no types, and I was like, hey, now add some types, like, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. I already do this without types. And I think a lot of like the TypeScript frustration with folks is that just like I'm suddenly dealing with a type system when I was perfectly capable of writing working code without it. And now it is yelling at me, and I do not like this. This does not make me happy. And I do not feel faster or more productive. I only feel frustration.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. I'd say the learning curve is steep enough and frustrating enough that it like it can feel bad like to do, and especially if you just like try to dabble a little bit, and then you just run into so many errors, or just like different when it's a different thought paradigm, right? And it's just you have to like change the way you think about it, to move. And this is probably true of other things, but like to move from a dynamic to a strongly typed language, the way you think about things kind of has to change, and it can be like speaking from personal experience, it can be hard to
Yeah.
to think that way. You know what I mean? And so you just end up running into your experience becomes just like error after error after error, and especially when you don't know it, the errors. I mean, when you do know it, the errors can be hard to parse. And the examples in tutorials and stuff sidestep a lot of that. Like a lot of the really hairy things. You know what I mean? But if you are used to writing, high level stuff, or if you're converting something to that you wrote, to TypeScript, I feel like that can be a big problem. Like I mean, it's certainly like something that makes it harder to learn.
Yes.
Like what, especially if you're dealing with React stuff. Like because the types in there are so can be so strange, and like the way you have to deal with refs and like all that stuff, and it. I understand now like why it is that way, but it can be hard. The first My first like TypeScript project was is and it's like still in development, but it was a component library, a React component library, and so I was like learning just like typed languages in general and TypeScript and all this stuff while trying to deal with like polymorphic, React components that can be that can be like um, like a div or a button or a component that you supply,
Hmm.
and that stuff is complicated enough without
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 TypeScript.
TypeScript,
Yes.
Um,
Um, I have very mixed feelings about. I mean, I absolutely agree with you. Like the types that like underpin the React system are wild, and like we've seen some of like the PRs and like the discussions on GitHub where people are talking about stuff, and I've not done enough math to know anything about what's going on here. Um, but then a part of me, like the appreciation I tend to take from those is like, oh, this is actually very complex, right? Like the type system, like it's all messy because like this is not trivial. And I think like static typing sort of exposes the complexity of the stuff we're working on, in a way like without the types, like, oh, I just call this function, it does this thing. There's some functions like some of the native JS ones. When I look, like you hover over and it does a TypeScript thing, and you're like, oh, this thing's got like a million overloads. It's got like a million potential return values. There's a bunch of optional parameters. Like, this is actually a very complex function, even though I just use it in this kind of throwaway way. So I don't know. There is something I appreciate, like forcing yourself. I mean, like you've seen it, like as we've like converted code bases from JS to TS. Like, oh, this is actually really involved. There's a lot going on here. There's a ton of things this could be, and I don't know. There's something like useful for that, and I think it makes it like as you go on and you start to write code, you start to think more about what am I introducing to this? Like how many like potential things am I now adding? Now you have this like appreciate. You start thinking like, oh, every time I just throw another field on here, I'm making this more complex. Like if I had just add it's like this more complex, and now like everything else has to deal with that. So there's so many times where when I was just writing Python, I was like, yeah, I'll just make this maybe return none, or like maybe just add a default or something. And I'm like, this makes everything else stranger. Is there a way I can like add this in like a really simple way that like doesn't blow up, or do I even need this extra thing, or like should this just be two completely separate things so like it's easier for me to deal with? And yeah, I don't know, that to me is a benefit of TypeScript, which is that after writing of types for a while, the code that I write, like even beyond the TypeScript checking this, I'm just writing code that's a little bit less likely to go wrong. Because every time I add something new, like my brain thinks of, what are like, what's this going to look like now? You know?
yeah, yeah, totally. I agree with all of that. Um, Ian in the comments says, yeah, I absolutely agree. TypeScript does feel like it adds an extra layer of complexity to your code base, but more often uh, than not, the trade off is worth it. And yeah, I agree. So like TypeScript complexity is a subjective term, right? But it's certainly TypeScript adds more lines of code, you know,
Hmm.
to like to a given anything, right? And or lines of code. I don't know, bytes of characters, whatever. In general, it
Yeah.
has more lines of code, and um, sometimes I think that doesn't always translate to complexity. I mean, if you know TypeScript, right? So this is like, yes, it becomes harder to look at if you don't know TypeScript, right? But like if you know TypeScript, like, and you look at a type and it's like you were saying, like a union type of strings or something like that. Um, I feel like when you're reading it, it actually becomes less complex because I mean, you know, so imagine that. All right, so imagine you have what's some good like string union example? Like what? Just just give me something so that I don't have
Um,
to.
my go-to is always like a app initialization. Like your app is either um, like initial state, loading state,
Yes,
or
yeah, yeah.
the
That's a
loading
good
of
one.
some value.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Right. Okay. So like status of all right, all right.
Hmm.
Or I'm gonna actually that made me think of like a request status, right? And so you have you know it's one of idle or loading or success or error, something like that, right? And if you didn't have that, if you don't have TypeScript, right, if you're just writing this in JavaScript, you could write that in the comments probably. And you could scan the code for like control structures. And hopefully you have a switch statement or something that's easier to like look at. Not hopefully because of code, but like that would make it easier to see the options, right? But otherwise, you're probably like going through and saying, okay, there's an if there, there's an if there, there's an else. Okay, what is the else? Else, you know, and you're end up like having to figure it out on your own.
Yeah.
If the comments say the options, hopefully the comments are accurate. you know, and like somebody didn't just add like an idle state later, right? So like idle is like something I would forget about the first time of writing like writing some
Hmm.
network handler, like an idle just means you haven't made the request yet.
Yeah.
And okay, we added that later because we realized we needed it, but forgot to update it in the comments or something. And so there's some reference to it later in the code, but if you don't read all the way to the end, you don't see it, or who knows. And so when you're writing your own, so if you're consuming that thing and you're writing your own handler, then you're going to be lost. Um, And I think that's like a place where there's actually going to be more code, more like lines of code written in the TypeScript because
Oh, yeah.
um because the union type will be there and stuff like that. But it actually makes, in my mind, it makes it less complex. And again, like that's subjective. But like I mean, I totally agree with Ian. I'm not like trying to argue with you. It's just like it's one of those things where there is a lot more code in a TypeScript project than a JavaScript project, I think. But um, and it's just like Ian said, the trade offs are worth it. And then like it becomes you get more. One of the things that I said was one of the things when I was talking to my friend about this was just the confidence, right? So from a developer perspective, whether I'm working on the project or like consuming the project, right? So if this is a TypeScript project that was published on npm, so I'm like using it. I if it's in TypeScript or if there's a typed, you know, library that somebody wrote, and usually there is, um, the confidence I have using it now is like much higher, right?
Mhm.
Because it's not just a matter of reading the docs and hoping both the docs are accurate, up to date, and like cover every single case. And also, I've read all of the like relevant parts.
Yeah.
But even without that, it's there's and this is starting to touch into another whole side of TypeScript that we haven't talked about, a benefit of like the developer experience. But the the confidence level that I have, like now, if I like if we're talking about that same request thing, right, with this request status, and it was just a JavaScript thing that didn't have types, I'd be in the same boat, right? I'd have to like hope the docs have the right thing.
Yeah.
And if I'm like reading that value. Ian mentioned in the comments React Query, and like that. I mean, this is where this status is coming from because I use React Query a lot, and React Query's docs are awesome. So don't get me wrong, but like if it's a smaller project and I was just looking at README, and in the same scenario, they forgot to update the docs when they added an idle feature. um, or or it's on the docs and I just missed it. I'm not going to know about it. And if it's in TypeScript, I will just by default. And if I have some case and I'm just like assuming that the default, like if I have a switch statement and I haven't handled all the cases or whatever, TypeScript will probably yell at me about it. Or if I'm,
Yes.
or if, even if I just misspell a status thing, if I say is idle instead of idle or something like that, I mean, that's a smaller thing. That's just like,
It's
I
still
don't know,
kind of useful, right?
but
Because
it's, yeah.
you know, well now we have like linters and like it'll probably catch something like that. But
Hmm.
there's definitely times where you write a word and there's no JS way of knowing that that is wrong. Only TypeScript. That's I don't think that's right.
Right.
Um, Absolutely, types as documentation is, I think, a big feature of statically typed languages, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, it's moving out of comments and out of functions into usually types at the top of the file. It's just in this place where you can see, you open a file, you see the types, and you're like, oh, that's what this does. Like this is what this is dealing with, and you have that context, and you kind of move on. I feel like that's super powerful, right? Like you said, it doesn't go stale, it doesn't go out of date because like if it changes, the functions change, or at least like if it changes and the functions don't change, and like oh, it all still works. It might not be exactly what you, but like it all still compiles and runs. Absolutely, I think that's really good. And yeah, it's like what's that thing they say in Python? Like simple is better than complex, but complex is better than complicated. It is more code, but in a way, it's like I feel like it's less complicated code because you're just saying what things have to be at the top, and now you know everything below has to match up with that. That's
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
less
Totally.
complicated.
Totally. And I think that's, yeah, that's pretty much what I was saying too. It's like, it's, wait, I didn't, wait, is complex or complicated the middle one of those two in the Python
Simple
thing?
is better than complex,
Complex.
right?
Complex is
But
better than
complex is
complicated. Yeah.
better
Yeah.
than complicated.
Yeah. You're
Yeah.
right. So if we're saying, yeah, if we're equating complex to like writing more things. Yeah. 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 Totally. And then like
Yeah.
the complicated thing is like trying to just read all the spaghetti,
Yes.
logic to cover the cases when, if the TypeScript, if the types didn't exist,
And
and,
generally,
oh yeah, go ahead.
quick aside, like that phrase is not just a JS. Like there's a lot of things, and I feel like it's like a general like good practice stuff. Like you, like I keep it simple, and then like at a certain point, like oh okay, I need to. It's like when do you refactor? Like oh this is gone by keeping this like either like all in one file or like one huge function or one super long switch. Like I kept it simple, and like now it's like complicated. It's like okay, I need to refactor here. Like I need more variable names, or like I need to break this out into subfunctions, or I need a class, or like some different like construct. It's like the code is more complex now. There's like more things going on, but it's no longer complicated. Like you can reason about it better. So that's just a general. I don't know. Sometimes I'll be working on something and I'm like this. Why does this feel so hard now? It's like oh I should have like refactored this like an hour ago into something that's I don't know, some more powerful programming technique. So general
Yeah.
good thing.
Yeah. 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 And so, yeah. So, again, Ian again in the comments said for most newbies, the yelling is the problem, right? Yeah. And like the red squiggles. I mean, like we've dealt with that a lot. I mean, we've talked about that a lot on the stream, and I've experienced the same thing. And everybody that I've been working with, that is especially this learning TypeScript it's very loud. It is. And it can be, it can be jarring. It can be, um, and frustrating certainly. And like I said before, the error messages sometimes like that's one of the biggest downsides for me is the error
Mm.
messages can be really, really bad, really hard to deal with, especially once you're like dealing with some library, where
Mhm.
it's like things are like nested away from the actual definition of whatever it is, and yeah, I mean, I don't really have a good answer for that. I hope they sort of improve that situation in the future. It's
Yeah.
once the more practice you get at it, the better you get at reading them. But it's still there's sometimes where and I am far from an expert, you know what I mean? But like where I'm just like, I don't have any idea what this is saying or what it's trying to tell me, like other than it's wrong, you know? And
Yes.
like, I think in my experience personally, lots of times when that's happened, like that situation I've run into, I actually discovered that I've done something like systematically wrong. Like I've made a mistake in some definition somewhere to get to that problem. That's not always the case, but like lots of times I've just misunderstood how to use a thing or whatever.
Yeah.
But it can be hard to get to that realization. It can be hard to figure out what, it doesn't really solve the base problem, which is like sometimes the error messages can be just really, really like gross,
No,
you know?
absolutely. I
Uh,
I think that I think to me that's the biggest downside of TypeScript right now.
yeah.
Just
Which is, I don't know. I mean, that's like, that's the biggest downside. I feel like that's saying something too, um, but yeah, no, Rebecca in the comments is the first steps are to make the red squiggles go away without using the any type. Yeah, it is. I mean, and it's like I find that now to be sort of satisfying lots of times. But that's because I've done it just long enough that I have confidence that I probably will be able to make it right. And then like you get the little boost of dopamine or whatever when you like make one of those go away when you get the green, instead of the red, which always like it feels good. Um, but certainly like yeah, that's like I think that's number one like downside for me is just that the if you're writing something for the browser, you're choosing to do something other than JavaScript. Okay, this TypeScript is like you're gonna have a set of like people that don't know it and have to struggle through it, to use it. So
yeah.
um the I'd say the other big benefit that I have that I think it was being discounted a little bit, but in my mind, it's I was struggling with a percentage of like there's the stuff we've mostly been talking about, which is like making your code safer, right? Like avoiding errors and all this stuff, right? This
Hmm.
is the stuff that TypeScript like does, right? The But the other side of this is like the developer experience improvements. And we've touched on little bits of this, but the like I was talking about the confidence that I have, consuming a thing that's written in TypeScript and
Hmm.
the ease of use. And like we talk about hovering over things like just kind of naturally now to see what they are or what they expect or whatever. But like that is a big part of TypeScript, right? And you know I think most people know, but not everybody knows. But like the VS Code stuff is all written in TypeScript, and so you can hover over in not a TypeScript project at all. You can hover over something in JavaScript, and it will. It's basically the TypeScript compiler doing its best to infer what it can, and give you some information. And if it is in TypeScript, then it will give you like very accurate information. And
Yeah.
then you can add like, and the way this is like this is VS Code that I'm really talking about, and I think there's other code editors that will do a good job of this too. But the if you add some comments to your TypeScript, your type definitions, especially the comments like in object parameters, what is it? Object methods, properties, uh, or, things like that, right? Those comments come through, and you can write Markdown, and you can make them like really pretty and good and useful, and like have add links to things, And we're talking about documentation as code, and so like there's this part of it makes it so easy to write these like very useful docs as you go as you are writing your types, and they're connected to this. They're connected to the type, so they're connected to the code. It's not just this like chunk of comments all the way at the top that is just happens to be above the code, right?
Yeah.
Um, you get your comments in line, like not in line, but like in the middle of your types, and those comments become attached to those types, and can get exposed. They can also be exposed. You can like there's programs to read those type definitions and the comments and generate documentation automatically, right?
Yeah.
um, which is really awesome. And like the closer that stuff is to the code, the easier it is to keep it maintained and keep it accurate. That's always the big problem with documentation is the maintenance of it, right, and keeping it up to date. So
Yes.
I think the developer experience like benefits of TypeScript are large, and um, I almost have said half the like at least half of the percentage for me, but I don't know if that's really accurate, but it's it's up there for me, at least my personal like the value that I get from it. I don't know. What do
Yeah.
you think?
No, I think that's 100%. Like when I think about if you're writing JavaScript in VS Code or like an editor of the appropriate configurations, all those hoverovers of all those little hints are like TypeScript going, and then it's either all the native JavaScript functions at this point have their .t.ts, right, just explaining what is going on. Like, if nothing else, the this like the current ecosystem where when someone makes a JavaScript library, they also make like a types thing just explaining like what my functions do, if nothing else, like if like your documentation is not up to par or not even there yet, at least I have this thing that says like, oh, this is the type of values that go into this, these are the type of values that come out of this. And that just makes things leagues better. I've been doing some work with some like low code tools recently, and they're like, you can write JS transformers, and with like zero information. Like you just type JS in it, and you hope for the best. Like if you want to know it works, you have to run it and just like see if it crashes or not. I'm like, this is rough. This feels like I'm out in the wilderness, not the Bear Grylls wilderness, the Les Stroud wilderness. Shout out to Les Stroud. That guy's for real.
There we
Um,
go.
so yeah, no, I think it's, and I don't know. I mean, we've seen this like we've seen this with Python, Ruby, like everything, like all these things, like ESLint, and then there was what was it? There was like what was the one before for JS, like JS type, or it was like a thing where you could add type info. Ah,
Like JS Doc.
not JS doc. It was like a JavaScript library where you could do this sort of like typey things for. I can't remember. It'll come to me, but it's it's like what TypeScript is doing is not something that we haven't wanted before. Like we've wanted these things, and like we've had different ways of like implementing them to some extent, and now we just have this thing that like it does it for you. If nothing else, TypeScript's like just a really good linter for JavaScript, but also you can do all these other things and like make sure that the JavaScript that you write is really and truly the JavaScript that you want to be writing, right? It's like what are all these types for? The types are so that like the things you write and you say, the things that you express in your code are like really the things that you want and like will work when you want them to work. And like helps you account for the weird quirks and edge cases that happen with like any complex system. Um, Lets you make meaningful decisions about what to do when something like might not exist up front instead of like after the first time it goes wrong. All these sort of things. And the thing I always tell people, what the type of thing that TypeScript does, we already started doing with JS, and that's just what promises are, right? Like promises say, hey, we're going to do this thing that might not work, and there's two paths, right? The dot then where it worked and was real, and like the dot like error, like when it was wrong. And we're not going to throw anything, right? We're just going to force you to like deal with these two paths, like in the code, in the data. But when you're in a then, the type of this thing is like this worked for sure. And the error is like this didn't work for sure, and that feels, I don't know, like everyone, I mean, promises have their own complexity, but for the most part, we like promises because they make it really easy to like write code that works and not accidentally like do stuff that doesn't work. And
I
TypeScript's doing
I
that.
don't like promises. So,
Okay. Start the stream over.
you know. Anything that has a callback, I'm just like I'm done. I'm done with this situation.
I don't know.
I didn't really
Isn't
like use
all
promises
of
at all
JS?
until async became a thing. I mean, like, so I understand like async functions technically return promises in the background,
Right.
whatever.
Yes. Okay.
But
Yeah.
like if you're in an async function, then you don't have to use like callbacks. But you can get yourself into trouble then, right? So like, because you say await and on a thing, you know, and then try to work on it. You just have to assume it's good, right? And so the and then like add a try catch or whatever. So
Right.
um
that is true. Although I don't know, my it's like async in a way. I don't hate them. Like doing it all like without them, just like raw, like promise.all and promise.this is feels worse for sure. But I'm like, maybe all of this just feels bad because like async IO is weird and bad. You know?
That is
Like
weird.
I
Yeah.
still prefer async away. Like it's making it easier, but ultimately this idea of like, hey, go do a thing and maybe it works and I'll check in with you later in like real time, but the rest of this code assumes that everything happens instantaneously
Yeah.
is just
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of ways
wonky.
to deal with it, and it's all wonky. All of them are wonky. So um, I just didn't want I didn't want the headline of this to be TypeScript Tuesdays love promises because I do not. So I I really kind of like working with them. You know what I'm saying? Um, oh, we got a question from a good question. So we think that front end tools like Vite, which give you the option to have your TypeScript with your scaffolding, have made TypeScript more approachable. And my answer is like an emphatic yes. But it's also like so. Before I talk about how like the answer the actual question, it's also so like a lot of these tools. Just to like explain this a little bit more, a lot of these tools when you're you get the like start like get started script, right? Like create React app or Vite or Remix or like Next.js, all these things, right? Lots of times now give you the option to say, okay, do you want this in JavaScript or do you want this in TypeScript, right? And that's both like a sign of TypeScript's like strength and popularity, and a thing that makes it more does make it more approachable and makes it more popular and things like that, right? And so if you start seeing all these tools where you're like getting TypeScript as an option, and you haven't used TypeScript yet, eventually you're going to be like, well, I want to know what this is about, you know, like, uh, so that's like part of that. But like, I absolutely think that it makes things more approachable because I don't have the like people that like TypeScript newbies, like myself included, don't have like I don't have the skills to like figure out take this like big package and convert it to TypeScript after after I've downloaded it and started using it. Like I would have no idea how to do that in Remix. I mean, I'm sure whatever I could figure some stuff out, but it's like the fact that you can just generate it with that TypeScript option as a default, and then see how they did it, and see how they've set things up. That's the part that I like the most out of those is getting a TypeScript package and looking at it. That's like it's useful for me because and it's more for me. It's more I don't know a better learning tool than reading tutorials and reading things because if I'm using this sort of tool, I'm probably already in like I already understand the domain. Like I'm already using it. You know what I mean? And so seeing how you do this. Okay, let's see now how we do this in TypeScript. Like something that I've already done. That is like a good like learning tool for me personally. Just from the way I learn, I do much better with my hands-on things than with sort of abstract, textbook style, or even like video style learning. Um, so yeah, I mean, Ian, my answer for your question is absolutely yes. I don't know, Kirk, do you have any thoughts on that?
Um, yeah, I think so. Um, I mean, I also think like for a lot of these things that were just JS before now being TS, it's it's a good just from like a business and design perspective. You know, the ecosystem is still there's a lot of people just using JS. There's a lot of people wanting to get into TS and making it super easy to like start with one or the other feels good or go from one to the other. Um, like we talked about earlier, TypeScript adds complexity. The ability to sort of like do that at your own pace feels important and good. It's not just like all in or not. We talked about like turning strict on, or even just again, it can be as simple as making sure that like full TypeScript linting is enabled in your VS Code, and you can like do the strict TypeScript linting if you wanted that. It's still all JS files. You can't write any new like TypeScript specific things but you can at least like see what your JS would look like if TypeScript was checking it, and then you can add it. There's a bunch of stuff. There's like so yeah, strict mode on, but like there's a bunch of things that are included in strict mode that you can add. Um, and then like what was it? The include JS is true or false, right? You start off like you should as you're including go, but yeah, keep the JS in there, and then when you're ready, you can turn that off. So I do think one of the good things that TypeScript has done is like made it really easy to like choose how much you want to get in there. And then as you get more comfortable, you can add more and more and more. And I think, yeah, the frameworks have all adopted that as well. And that just feels smart on their part because then you can accommodate folks who are proficient in TS, folks who aren't ready to do that jump yet. Um, and everyone kind of like gets what they want out of it. And I will say on their part, for a lot of them, they have started writing more of these frameworks in TypeScript. So it's even easier for them to just like make that option available. It's like, well, we're already here. Um, I don't know. Again, I'm still thinking about like what we talked about earlier, just like those error messages. I think about languages like Rust and Elm, and an error message is a strange thing because an error message is like a broken zipper. Like no one thinks about it until it happens, and then it's like your only problem. It's like pants with a broken zipper aren't pants anymore. A torn pant leg, still pants. Broken zipper, they're not pants, so I can't wear them to do pants things. I will be kicked out of the bank. um,
This personal experience again.
I'm not at liberty to say. But just to get back on track, like one of the things I've heard from the Rust community, I can say it's for the Elk community, the compiler has these really concise and what feels like helpful error messages. It's not perfect, obviously, but it's like really good, and it's
This
not
is Russ.
noisy. Rust and
Rust.
Elm are the two
Okay.
languages that
Isn't Elm the one where you get an error and the error message is like, you obviously didn't read the docs. Read this paragraph in the docs.
that happened to you one time, and you
It happened to
figured
me so many
it
times. I did Elm for like 3 days and I got so upset at it. I'm sure you're right though. I'm sure they're better than.
Yes, usually it's more like, hey, you said this, did you mean? But it's not, I don't know.
Right, right, right. Yeah, no, they're
I
it seems
feel
like they're
like they're,
written
yeah,
they're written by humans and the
yes,
TypeScript errors all seem like they're just generated from a machine.
yeah. And there's two parts to that because there's also sort of like, so we talk about like TypeScript type errors, but there is also a version of this in all languages, which is like the stack trace vomit, which is also very unappealing. Um, so both Elm and Rust, and like, well, TypeScript doesn't have to do it because TypeScript's issues are never about a stack trace. Like they're about like type resolving. Um, but like, so what's my general theme here? Um, Having good error messages versus what feels just like computer generated vomit is good and helpful. What I am hopeful about is that it feels like a fixable problem because I know there are these other languages that have dealt with it in a way that like most of the people who use languages really like. The problem is important enough that the people who have a good experience with it cite it as like a significant source of joy and reasons why they keep using the language, which is why I really want it in TypeScript. TypeScript has a ton of cool features, and it's kind of like it's a little sad that like someone might not make it to the good parts of TypeScript because like yeah, it just yelled at me for 4 days and then I just switched back to JS because it really can do that, especially if you're turning it on like something with like big records or big objects or just like quirky types, and like TypeScript feels the need to tell me all 17 fields when the problem is only with one of those fields. And I wish you just said only the field that is wrong, right? But it's not sophisticated enough yet to do that. It can get there. I absolutely think it can get there. I know people are working on it, but until that's the biggest thing. People stop TypeScript because TypeScript yells at them. Um, it's like a kid. Like TypeScript doesn't know how to use its words effectively. So TypeScript just cries. Um, And that kind of sucks, you know. So half the time when I'm working with someone new with TypeScript or we're talking about TypeScript, it's like a really slow and steady like walkthrough. They're like, oh, and yell. I'm like, yeah, it's okay. We're gonna figure out. We're gonna look over that error. We're gonna try and see what it means. And you've seen this. Like you get an intuition now for like the type of yelling, even though you don't know the details. It's like these certain shapes come up. You're like, okay, I think the shape of this means that this might be wrong. I think the shape means this might be wrong. You start to identify like, oh, I've done something wrong in the type system a couple miles up versus like I just like said something incorrectly or I passed the function wrong. You can get it there. But
Yeah.
you get that over time. Doing that on your own, super frustrating, right? Doing that when you're new to TypeScript or new to types in themselves, you're like, are all types like this? Is this just how types work? It's like, no, it doesn't have to be. There are languages where this doesn't have to happen. So I don't know. That's a thing I think about a lot. And I think like TypeScript's growing at like a big rate, right? People are getting into it. But I think like the thing that's still keeping it from or the last big hurdle in my opinion that it has that like it's in the ecosystem now, it's like integrated into like the major frameworks. There's a ton of resources and documentation on it, but at the end of the day, like it's got to stop yelling at people. you know Great guy, he's got a good head on his shoulders, real sweetheart, but he's got to lower his voice. um, that's TypeScript to me. It's a man who just needs to be a little bit quieter, and everything will be fine.
I
It's my hot take.
yeah, no, I could get behind that. I was looking on the TypeScript like roadmap, and oh, there is a future thing. The only thing that mentions errors is investigate error messages in haiku or iambic pentameter.
Oh
So
my,
I
I,
clicked on that, and apparently it's just a joke from Twitter. Somebody said they should always be error messages should always be like that, and then one of the TypeScript maintainers added it to the roadmap. So
I'll take it.
it's nice that they're just joking about it and not actually trying to improve it.
Well, okay,
uh,
I
you know,
do know that there are a group of people, and I think like Matt Pocock is one of them, who are actively investigating. And he's got a small site. I can try and pull up the link. Like it's called like was it? It's like translate TypeScript. Like you put in the TypeScript error and it tries to say like, okay, what this really means is, you know, it's obviously like, it can't work as like, oh, whenever I get a TypeScript error, I copy paste it into this website and then I go back to work on it. So like there's some integration should be possible, but at least I know there's people thinking about it, and it would be great to see, even if the maintainers are like, we're focusing on other stuff, that's fine, But like if it becomes like a language extension or just even like a VS Code extension, like something that can do that, that'd be great. Um, because I do think that's important, right? Like TypeScript is when you are correct, TypeScript feels like I am doing everything right. I am blazing through. This is this type. I did a transformer. It's this type. The map is like this is. I know what's going on. But like when things go wrong, most of the time, let's be fair, most of the time, TypeScript's just like, hey, you need this field. They're like, hey, this can't be empty. And you're like, cool. But you know, often enough, it's like, hey, and you just, I don't know.
yeah,
I don't know TypeScript. I don't know what you're saying.
yeah. It can be tough to get all the way down. I mean, I've started just like ignoring everything and scrolling to the bottom of whatever it
Yes.
is, and that's like a pro tip. But like, why is it that hard? I understand that like it's this it's basically a stack trace, right? And
Yes.
Ian was complaining about in JavaScript, you have a React error and you get a huge like stack trace in the console, and like the thing that's relevant is usually not all of that stuff. You know what I mean? But it can be helpful when it's like hard to or when it's something complicated. Or you do run into that sometimes, but lots of times it's just like the thing at the end, or like the top level thing. And if TypeScript could like figure out a way to, I don't know, surface that a little easier, I feel like that would be a big help. And that might not even be TypeScript, but even just the VS Code extension or something, maybe that's it. I'm not exactly sure. So it's definitely an area of, I could see some, I would like to see some improvement. But, um,
Yeah.
All right. Well, did we miss anything? I don't know. We should wrap up here in a few minutes. Did we miss any either benefits or, um, I guess, negatives that that like come to your head that we and feel free in the comments. I mean, if you reach for TypeScript because of something that we haven't mentioned yet, I'd love to hear about it too. I'm like looking for any support here. So I would always love to hear from anybody. But yeah, I don't know, Kirk. Did we
I mean,
kind of hit on all the like major points?
I think we hit. I think, well, for me, some of the major benefits. I will say, okay, well, I'll do one disadvantage first. I don't know if we kind of touched on it, but not really, and then I'll get into like my major advantage. And that different disadvantage is like it's another thing to configure. Like modern development is just I have like a source folder of like three things and just like 75 configuration files. I got a CFGs, I got like M's, I got like every every static site builder has got its own like, oh, this is in Toml, this is in YAML. I'm just like, I hate all of this. And when I open other people's
Yes.
projects, I'm like, I want to work on that. There's just like a million weird extensions. I'm like, what the hell is this? So it's another thing to configure. So in addition to learning TypeScript, you also have to sort of like learn the mechanics of TS config. What does include mean? What does this mean? What does like output mean? And it you can get there's some templates you can get started pretty quickly, but again, another config is
Yeah.
harder.
Oh, I mean that goes to like what Ian's question about having these projects and making it TS like TypeScript more approachable, and like that's one of the reasons why, right? Is like I don't have to. It's interesting to look at, but if I have a framework generate a TypeScript like you know packet like a project for me, right? A project like starter that has TypeScript set up the way that it will. I know that it'll work with their with their project.
Mhm.
It's just like a whole nother thing that 'cause I don't I agree with you. I don't ever wanna look at config files. I don't wanna look at any of that stuff. I have, like I've managed to avoid ever, like, building Webpack stuff by myself. I've always used o other projects that abstract it out, because it's such a nightmare, and I don't wanna do it, and,
Oh,
um, it's like I don't, and, like, I've had to get into a little more of that kinda stuff with, Rollup, with publishing a package, publishing, like, an npm package, that other people can install, then you have to start thinking about some of that stuff a little bit more. But um, it's still like, yeah, that like config stuff, and that's like another, you know, you're always going to have that if you're like the further steps away you are from, I don't know, JavaScript. You're going to have to deal with that, and it does kind of suck. Uh, I don't know.
yeah. Um, right, but then okay, so that was my one.
Okay, I
We
like
should
it.
also talk about that because it is totally a thing,
Yes,
and
totally
it took
valid.
us quite a while to figure out like, what do I want this thing to do? What is the good thing? I mean, I truly think that TypeScript has a very powerful and expressive type system. And it has been to my benefit to be able to express code using the TypeScript type system versus just um, JS functions and values. I get to do this thing where I think about a problem and I write types to represent the actual shape of the space I'm working in. And then afterwards, it's like a template or a blueprint that the rest of my code follows and it does the thing that I want. Not just like on a, I forced it with a bunch of like ifs and like conditions, but like truly the rest of my code just becomes transforms from like these shapes that matter to these other shapes that matter in a way that feels performant and expressive and repeatable and all the good things about code. Um, Even if you don't end up writing TypeScript, even if you end up going back to JavaScript, I still think like it helps to do some work in TypeScript. It will just slightly adjust the way you solve problems for the better in a way that's like just leads to, I think, better working code. And like you get to understand like where you need to be more verbose and where you need to be less verbose, and like when it matters. And like it matters when there's some ambiguity that like needs to be addressed. It's worth being wordier at the beginning of processes to get rid of ambiguity so that later code gets to be like more sure and more correct. And ultimately, that's like, what is TypeScript for? Your code is more correct, not shorter, not simpler, just more correct than it otherwise would have been. And that is good.
Yes, I love that. Yeah, so yeah, I don't think I have any new cons or pros to add to this. It's just like underline. Like the more we talk about it, even the more that I think like one of the largest benefits. And so this is like, I mean, this is what I'm in my life right now. I'm in like three different projects where I'm creating an installable library. I'm creating something that's published and other programs consume it, right? And the value that you get from TypeScript from that, from that like transaction is just like it's so huge. The As a consumer of a package, having it had like I don't even need to be write it like I could consume this thing in a JavaScript project, not a TypeScript project at all. And well, for one thing, it still works, and which is awesome. And for another, I get value out of it, especially if I'm using VS Code. But I should look this up sometime. But if I was using a different code editor, I think the value, I think probably it would still be in there. Um, the the like the value and the confidence and the help that you get from a TypeScript, a project that was written in TypeScript, it's just like it's huge for me. And,
Yep.
so I think that's my top like headline. So yeah, Ian says in the chat, once you go TypeScript, you never go back. And I am honestly finding that to be true for myself. Every time we have like the projects that I've been working on, there is sort of a mix. Some projects are still in JavaScript and some are in TypeScript. And yeah, I find myself wishing that I had TypeScript often when I'm in just a JavaScript project. So much that I'm like, should I just like add TypeScript and start this?
Yes.
But it's like when you're on a team, you have to have these conversations. So but I totally agree with that. Uh, so yeah, I don't know, Kirk, you have any final thoughts or anything like that?
Um, I think I don't know. I think this is. I think we did good and sort of. I think we were fair. Like obviously, we're both pretty much like TypeScript is good, unlike enums, but TypeScript's not perfect, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect. Is it just better than the alternative? Yes. I was the most diehard Python person of all time, and I thought like dynamic energies were it. I was all about the duck typing, yada yada yada. Then I did a complete 180, and now I'm in this place where it's like again you end up in this middle ground of like, no, I think like types are good. Being able to express types in a way feels good. Um, they come with some problems, right? You now have this other thing yelling at you, but when you get it working, the code that you end up with feels like good code. So it's worth. If you've been trepidatious about TypeScript, I would say if you take anything from this, it's worth trying, but just like go small. Don't try and do like everything at once. Ask for help. You know, there's like me and Dan and a whole bunch of other people in Virtual Coffee who will be willing to like help you work through it. But yeah, it can be a benefit just for writing software in general. So go for it.
I like it. Okay, well, if that is it, I think we'll wrap up for today. I'm probably not going to be around next week. Kirk, are you going to be around? Do a stream or not?
I probably. It's a
Okay.
solid probably right
All
now.
right. Well, then probably catch us back next week. And by us, I mean Kirk and possibly another guest and not me, unless I change my mind, in which case I'll be there too. So this has been a very informative little announcement in general, Tuesdays at 2 p.m. And yeah, so we're streaming here. So we're streaming on Twitch and YouTube and Twitter. And so you can catch replays on YouTube or I think Twitter. I think they stick around there too. And you can catch a lot of the other stuff that Virtual Coffee does on YouTube and check out our site, virtualcoffee.io. You can follow Kirk at Kirk Codes on Twitter. You can follow me at Daniel T. Ott on Twitter. And of course, Virtual Coffee IO on Twitter, Twitch, YouTube. Do we have anything else? Oh, I think there's Instagram, maybe LinkedIn. I don't really know. I'm not on either of those, so I don't actually know, but I'm pretty sure that those exist for Virtual Coffee. So, if that's your jam, go follow us on all the things and have a good holidays if you are celebrating the holidays. And otherwise, we will catch you later. All
See
right.
you later.